Well, President Trump is calling on the Department of Commerce to make a new census. The president wants the department to, quote, begin work on a new, highly accurate census based on modern-day facts and figures. He goes on to say people who are in our country illegally will not be counted in the census. Now, for more on this, I'm joined by Hansi Lo Wang. He's a correspondent at the Washington desk for NPR. Hansi, thanks so much for joining us. First off, I think a lot of people aren't clear on what the census process actually looks like. Can you explain that?
When we're talking about the census, we are talking about the bedrock of U.S. democracy. The Constitution lays out instructions for a count of persons every 10 years. It's a count of persons. You won't find the word citizen in the Constitution's instructions. And since 1790, there's been a thorny history of exactly which persons residing in the country was counted and by how much. But one thing is true, which is that no resident of the United States without immigration, without legal status in the United States has been left out of the census. And these are numbers used to determine each state's share of congressional seats and electoral college votes.
Now, is it even possible to make changes before the next census?
That's an interesting question, because I think the real question is, what is President Trump calling for? He's calling for a new census. Does he mean the 2030 census? The preparations are already underway for that. Is he calling for a new census before 2030? Those are really that's a big question to answer, because that means how much time is left to prepare for this census. The Census Bureau takes more than a decade to prepare for a census. And then the question about potentially excluding people living in the states without legal status. That's a big question, because the 14th Amendment of the Constitution calls for the whole number of persons to be included in the numbers used to redistribute House seats and electoral college votes. So the question possibility here, there are a lot of other questions that we need answered first.
And Hansi, here's an even bigger question. Does a president even have the authority to do this?
If you take a look at Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress is given the final authority over the census, not the President of the United States. It's Congress who has set up instructions in federal law of taking a census once every 10 years. And right now, there are no instructions that at this point for a mid-decade census. There is a bill introduced by Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia that President Trump says he supports. It calls for a new census and new redistricting before the 2026 midterm election. Also calls for excluding all non-citizens living in the country from what the 14th Amendment says should be a whole number of persons in the whole count. But that bill is not law yet, and there would likely be lawsuits if that bill becomes a law.
Now, as you mentioned, the Constitution seems pretty clear on this. Could there be consequences for not counting all the people in the country?
We're talking about representation in the House of Representatives, as well as those votes in the Electoral College, that those will shift if a certain population is not included in those numbers. And when we're talking about the census, we should also keep in mind this is data, vital data used to redraw voting maps for every level of government across the country. It's also used to distribute federal funding to communities for public services, and businesses, researchers rely on this data as setting up reality of who is living in the United States, what their needs are. It's based on census data. If that is inaccurate, we're going to have a lot of questions about who is living in this country.
All right, Hansi Lo Wang, thanks so much for joining us.